Today is Thursday, May the 7th, 1998, and this is a lecture given for the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society by Reverend Peter Meggs on the topic of the Anglican mission to the Jewish community in Lowertown.
It's okay.
Oh, it's so sweet.
Got to get past that. Right here.
Oh, good.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation and welcome here tonight. I feel as though I'm among friends, and I'm very pleased to be here in this particular synagogue, and the reason for that I'll tell you about later. This story that I have to tell tonight arose through a book that was published by the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa called Anglicanism in the Ottawa Valley. And since I've been involved for a few years in Jewish-Christian dialogue and Christian-Muslim dialogue, they asked me to do a chapter on interfaith relations in the first 100 years of the Anglican Church in this diocese. And I said to them I thought this was going to be the shortest chapter in the book. However, it has turned out that I did write a chapter for it. You don't have to buy it because you're going to hear the same story tonight. But it's an interesting story in many ways. I think it does reflect some of the times that we lived through. Some of you may have had relatives, ancestors, and so on in the community in Lowertown, and I'd particularly like to hear from you later because you probably know a lot more about this era than I do. But it's a period which I think it merits looking at again because it covers a number of years, and those years were important. Now, anyone who has read Brian Doyle's wonderful little novel, Angel Square, set in Lowertown, Ottawa in the 1940s, will recall that 3 schools fronted on the square. There was St. Bridget's School of the Bleeding Thorns, where Irish Catholics, known as Dogans, attended. The School of Brother Brébeuf for children of French Canadians, known as Pea Soups. And York Street Public School for the rest of the children, including Jewish children, known as Jews. And you will recall that the children of all 3 schools were constantly at war with one another. But the story really centers on Tommy, who was of no particular religious persuasion at all, and his attempt to track down, in a detective-like way, the person who assaulted his father, or at least, assaulted the father of his best friend, Sammy Rosenberg. Now, in some ways, Doyle's description of life in Angel Square, and I've spoken with Brian Doyle about this, had sad echoes in my own childhood growing up in East Toronto, where children of Catholics and Protestants, called Catholicers and Protestinkers by one another, followed the rag and bone man's wagon, calling out, "You killed Christ." And my blood runs a bit cold when I repeat that. And where in Toronto's Sunnyside amusement park there was a sign outside the large outdoor swimming pool that read, "No dogs or Jews." But it is Lowertown that I want to speak about this evening. Though I suspect some of this feeling will come through in what I have to say when I go through this history. And I want you to try to imagine, if you will, if you didn't grow up here, grow up there in Lowertown, and I don't think there's probably anybody here who did, but try to imagine a morning in October in the year 1915. And I would like to introduce you to someone going through the market in Lowertown. His name is the Reverend Mark Melbert. And as he goes through the market, he stops to watch farmers unloading fresh apples outside Abraham Lithwick's grocery store. Then he strolls on for a couple of blocks east of the market area where other farmers are delivering meat to Halpern's butcher shop. Along the way, he waves to the scrap metal peddlers leaving their stables to trade tin for scrap metal in the surrounding countryside. They had Jewish-sounding names as well, as did the wagon drivers heading out into Ottawa streets crying rags, bones, and bottles. Melbert passes Slomensky's General Store at the corner of Rideau and Musgrove Streets, calling out a greeting to Mrs. Slomensky in Yiddish, the lingua franca of most Ottawa Jewish immigrants at the time, and the only means of communication for some. Melbert was himself a Jew from Austria who had converted to Christianity and was the first permanent appointment to the Anglican mission to the Hebrews in Ottawa's Lowertown. He knew most of the pawnbrokers, jewelers, watchmakers, cobblers, wood dealers and cabinet makers, tailors, dairy operators, real estate agents, furniture dealers, second-hand clothing dealers, cigar makers, and general store operators that constituted the Jewish community of Lowertown. One of those general stores, clothing stores, of course, later became Freeman's, as we now see it still there as the Hudson's Bay Company. He may even have known of the Jewish dance instructors in Lowertown and the Jewish auctioneer. Now, I don't want to leave the impression that Lowertown was all Jewish, a kind of ghetto. Jews were outnumbered by English and Irish settlers, and of course there were many French Canadians among the merchants and residents. But the proportion of Jews in Lowertown was significant enough to arouse attention and concern among the non-Jewish population, as we will discover in a moment. The Jewish population of Lowertown was largely a result of pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia at the beginning of the century that had forced Jews to seek refuge in other lands, and the fact that the Laurier government was welcoming able-bodied young men to help open a rapidly growing Canada. Now, Lowertown was Mark Melbert's parish, if you like, and he saw the Jewish residents as his potential parishioners. And we get some idea of how poor most of Lowertown's Jews were from these entries in Melbert's first report in 1915 to the board of the Ottawa Hebrew Mission. And I'll just read a couple of them for you. A young Jew out of work during 6 weeks for food, $5. One family assisted twice with coal and wood and food, $7.75. Assistance twice to widow and children for fire and for food, $6. A family assisted in sickness for coal and boots for 3 children, $13.40. Assistance to young Jews, a young Jew with month's rent for a room, $4. Now that was an account of the mission's relief fund. And the mission's relief fund was not the only assistance to Jews, nor was Anglican concern for Jews confined to Ottawa. Melbert's report includes a donation of $80 from a Mrs. W.H. Fraser for the relief fund of the Polish Jews in the war zone. The missionary passed this contribution along to Mr. A.J. Freeman, the treasurer of the fund in the Jewish community. The Hebrew Mission Fund, Relief Fund, could only have helped, even in a small but practical way, the distress of some Jewish immigrants moving into Lowertown. Brian Doyle speaks of this as a time when people lived in, and he himself did, as a matter of fact, in wooden houses and had to work hard to get enough coal or wood to keep themselves warm in the wintertime. This distress was particularly evident in the bitter Ottawa winters. In his 1915 report, Melbert tells this story. Last November, a Jew came to the missionary's house with an expulsion order from his landlord. The missionary went to see the landlord and prevailed upon him to allow the man to stay on condition of paying $10, which was part of $30 owing for 3 months' rent. Messrs. George Byrne and W. W. Fraser kindly gave $5 each for this purpose. Now, why and how did Mark Melbert come to the Anglican mission and become the missionary to the Jews in Ottawa? Well, the answer to the first question, I think, lies in the missionary zeal of the Church of England that reached back to the Wesley brothers, John and Charles Wesley, who wrote so many hymns, and the rise of Methodism. And this zeal grew in direct ratio to the expansion of the British Empire in the 19th century and into the first half of the 20th century. It produced missionary hymns, many, many of them, with verses like this one composed by Bishop R. Heber in 1819. Can we whose souls are lighted with wisdom from on high, can we to men benighted the lamp of life deny? Salvation, O salvation, the joyful sound proclaim, till each remotest nation has learned Messiah's name. And the Jews had a special place in the mandate of the church. Here's a verse from another Anglican missionary hymn from the early 19th century. Jewish people wandering far, still thine own dear children are. Bring them home, dear Lord, to thee, safe from sin and sorrow free. Now, the theme of bringing home the Jews to the one shepherd, Jesus, was prominent in one of the opening prayers of the Good Friday liturgy in Anglican churches. It was reserved for this day as the day when the Jews were seen to have caused the crucifixion. And Evan Daniel, in his work, The Prayer Book, points out that prayers for the Jews in the medieval church, quote, were not to be said kneeling, which was the normal posture for Anglicans praying, were not to be said kneeling. So completely did the prejudice triumph over the teaching of the day. The Good Friday prayer for the conversion of the Jews persisted in the Anglican Church of Canada until the new prayer book of 1985, as did the practice of donating the Good Friday collections to evangelistic work among the Jews. The use of the prayer was not officially removed from Canadian Anglican practice until 1992. Now, it was against this background that the Ottawa Diocesan Women's Auxiliary, known as the WA, so when I say WA, you know who I mean, launched the Mission to the Hebrews in Lowertown. The first recorded mention of its existence is found in a report of the WA to the Missionary Society of the Church of England in Canada, otherwise known as the MSCC. And it appears first in 1908. It tells of an address given to the WA by the Reverend D.G. Neugewertz, missionary to the Jews in the Anglican Diocese of Montreal, on, quote, the work so dear to his heart, the evangelization of the Jews, unquote. The following year, the WA's report to MSCC indicates that, quote, a work has been going on at intervals for several years in the city of Ottawa, which has for its object the evangelization of the Jews. The report explains that the Reverend D.G. Neugewertz was a missionary from the London, England School for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews, and that he conducted the branch in Ottawa from his base in Montreal. In fact, the Ottawa branch had been established in 1906. Now, how much earlier the work was going on among the Jews in Ottawa, I don't know. But we do know that he established that branch from Montreal in Ottawa in 1906. In 1909, Sarah Kuzner, the convener of the WA, reviewed the progress of the WA's Standing Committee on Work Among the Jews. There were classes for girls and for men, presumably with some Christian instruction, at Waller Street Public School. and in door-to-door visits to Jewish homes, Neugewertz distributed tracts in Hebrew and copies of the New Testament in English. The results were discouraging. The classes had dwindled to almost nothing, and most Jewish immigrants read neither Hebrew nor English. But Mrs. Kusner's remained optimistic. She felt that Sabbath attendance at the synagogue was also in decline, and this meant, in her words, that Judaism was, quote, practically dead. Instead of attending synagogue, she noted that, quote, restless and dissatisfied Jews were seeking out socialistic meetings to find a solution to their questionings. She had already called for a resident missionary who could speak Yiddish and declared, quote, the field is white unto harvest. She ended her report by returning to the subject of those socialistic meetings. We can almost hear the fervor of this woman as she declares, quote, of such stuff anarchists are made. And she must have had a second thought, because she adds, or missionaries like Saul of Tarsus. Which shall it be? At least part of Mrs. Kusner's question seems to have found an answer. In 1911, she reported to the MSCC that 6 WA branches within the diocese were offering help with the work among the Jews, and Gospels were now being distributed in Yiddish. She gives us something of the flavor of the times with this remark from someone she describes as, quote, an eminent divine. God has prospered many nations of the earth. He has made Greece the great depository of art and literature. He has made Rome the mistress of the world. He has made England the great instrument of the most potent civilization. He made the Jewish nation his own people, the people of God. And then Mrs. Kusner issues a call to go forward in what she calls the work that has as its object the conversion of the race to which our Lord belonged, the race from which he chose his disciples, the race for which he prayed when he hung upon the cross of Calvary. End of quote. The call was urgent, she said, in view of the enormous influence which the Jew is wielding in this world, especially throughout Christendom. There it is again. End of quote. This concern for the number of Jews in Canada and the world and their influence is reflected in other Canadian Anglican documents at the time. The Jewish Historical Society records placed the Jewish population of Ottawa at the turn of the century at 398 and 1,772 a decade later. In Anglican records, that second number is more than doubled to 4,000. And I'm inclined to agree with the Historical Society, the Jewish Historical Society, on those figures. But it does reflect, I think, a bit of alarm on the part of non-Jewish people. In 1911, Mrs. Kusner's admission that, quote, so far as we know, there are no baptized Jews in Ottawa, was mitigated by the news that the bishop had appointed the Reverend G.G. Wright as temporary diocesan missionary to the Jews, replacing the Reverend D.G. Neugewertz, who was returning to his work among the Jews in Montreal. But the diocese in WA seems to have made an impact on the Anglican Church at the national level. In 1912, the MSCC created a national committee, quote, to consider the whole question of work among the Jews in the Dominion of Canada, unquote, and to report back at the next meeting in 1913. The 4 dioceses most concerned were Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, and Niagara. Why Niagara? Well, it was for work among the Jews in Hamilton. The committee was also empowered to engage experienced workers among the Jews. Now, astonishing as it seems today, the National Committee recommended to the MSCC that missionaries to the Jews should be, quote, young clergymen of Gentile extraction, unquote. Suitable Hebrew Christians could be employed as agents, whatever that was, in a mission, but the heads of missions were to be Gentile Anglican priests. And there was no mention of Yiddish. perhaps even more indicative of the thinking among non-Jews at the time, were the obstacles the National Committee saw that hindered successful evangelization of the Jews. And among these obstacles, the committee listed the following. 1, the Jews themselves. The mere fact that they are more sober and thrifty than their Gentile neighbors feeds the self-righteousness that seems to be inherent in Judaism. 2, the desire of attaining wealth hinders the Jews from taking an interest in spiritual matters. 3, the opposition of the rabbis. Surprise. 4, the lack of sympathy from Christians. 5, the memory of persecutions endured by them in Christian lands. They have a contempt for Christianity, knowing it only as they have seen and felt it in Eastern Europe. Those were 5 of the obstacles they saw to converting Jews to Christianity. When the Reverend G.G. Wright gave up the work in Lowertown in 1913, the diocesan W.A. maintained regular visits to Jews in hospital and arranged lectures for Jewish mothers in home nursing. They also skillfully sidestepped the recommendations of the National Committee and obtained the services of Mark Melbert, whose parents were Jewish and who spoke Yiddish. Melbert was sent to Ottawa by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in London at the request of the Missionary Society of the Church in Canada. Melbert seems to have settled in well in Ottawa with his family and gone to work immediately. His first report indicates that he had been working, quote, quietly in the homes of Jewish families, unquote, and he claims one believing family as a result of his visits. While there had only been 400 attendances by Jews that year in the Sunday meetings in the mission hall, he put this down to, quote, fear of ostracism from the Jewish community, unquote. One suspects that he may not have been a very observant Jew before his conversion. In his first report, he enlightens his readers about Jewish worship. He says that the Jews who attend synagogue in Ottawa, quote, gabble their prayers in Hebrew. Anglicans gabble them in English. He goes on to explain that, quote, the lesson for the week is taken from the Pentateuch, or the Torah, and read from a roll of parchment, which must be written by hand, and a corresponding portion is read from the prophets. Then he adds, it is a mere form, and being in Hebrew, the great majority do not understand the meaning. Judaism is a dead religion, unquote. Now, it was this so-called dead religion that literally embraced and nourished the Jewish community of Lowertown with 4 congregations, a Talmud Torah school for Jewish children, a Zionist society, a Jewish colonial trust, and a lively social life within the community. It was wartime, and Mrs. A.J. Freeman had installed 30 sewing machines in her home and formed the Jewish Women of Ottawa Red Cross Sewing Circle to make warm clothes for the troops. She also raised large sums of money for the war effort from Jews and Gentiles alike in Ottawa. The Anglican Hebrew Mission also had a sewing class for women and a service for children on Saturday afternoons where, quote, with the consent of their parents, a few Jewish children are brought into touch with the gospel, unquote. There seems to have been little hostility between the Ottawa Hebrew Mission and members of the Jewish community, despite the presence on the Hebrew Sabbath of Melbert distributing tracts in Hebrew and Yiddish New Testaments, and the conviction stated in his first report that, quote, the uplifting influence of Christianity and the power that rests in the gospel will in the end break the stony heart of the house of Israel. I should mention that he always handed these out. They sent literature to the homes of Jewish families, but he handed out tracts outside the synagogue on the Sabbath. He handed out the New Testaments in Yiddish and tracts in Hebrew. The Hebrew Mission appears to have begun its life at 388 McLaren Street. In 1921, the diocesan WA signed a 5-year agreement with St. John's Anglican Church on Elgin Street to lease space for work among the Jews in the basement of St. John's Mission Church, St. Augustine's, at the corner of Chapel and Clarence Streets in Lowertown. By this time, Jews were living in other parts of the city as well as Lowertown, and in 1922, Melbert is described as, quote, the rector of St. Augustine's, besides being the MSCC Jewish missionary for the whole of Ottawa, which means that funds must have been coming from the National Missionary Organization in Toronto, the MSCC. The move of the mission to the heart of Lowertown was perhaps too little and too late. Jewish confidence was growing as the Jewish community grew. In his 1918 report to Synod, the governing body of the diocese, Melbert reports his first encounter with physical resistance. A Polish Jew with memories of suffering at the hands of Christians assaulted Melbert entering a store. Melbert recounts the incident as follows. Oftentimes in a store, when business is slow, Jews will assemble and the missionary will have an opportunity to discuss the claims of Christ. Of course, the occasional rudeness and blasphemy must be taken in good grace, and personal abuse disregarded. Sometimes the other Jews will silence the churl and defend the missionary. In 1920, Melbert reported to Synod that life for him was becoming more difficult. The Jews were sufficiently settled that few calls were being made on his relief fund. They were better organized. They had their own benefit societies and their own Young Men's Hebrew Association. When Melbert started night classes in English, the Jewish leaders started one of their own on the same night. Now, if all was not going well with the Hebrew mission in the early 20s, it was not evident in the report of the diocesan convener of work among the Jews in March of 1923. She announced to the WA board that, quote, there is one Jewish girl who now comes to our church services. Wonderful success has attended the rise of the use of collecting boxes. One Bible class gave $10 when they found that the Jewish work would be carried on. That's the end of her report. But it appears that the MSCC had seen the handwriting on the wall. In 1924, they withdrew the funding from Melbert in Ottawa and turned his future over to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in London. And that organization promptly dispatched him to Poland to convert Jews in Krakow. I'm not sure how he did there. Once again, it was up to the diocesan WA to take up the torch in Ottawa. This they did, with the WA convener issuing the challenge in her 1924 report, we must go forward in faith, knowing that God will bless every effort to bring the gospel light to his blinded people. This reference to God's blinded people runs through a lot of the literature. The bishop appointed a Reverend Gordon Carrier to replace Melbert, but he resigned 2 years later due to ill health. The mission moved out of the basement of St. Augustine's to an upstairs reading room at 256 Rideau Street, where Jews were welcomed on Saturday evenings. In the space of 8 months, only one Jewish inquirer turned up, and as far as we know, he never came back. In 1926, the reading room was abandoned, and the bishop appointed a priest whose name, the Reverend W.S. Weary, may have reflected his interest in the assignment. He could only devote 1 day a week to the Hebrew mission work. Funds in the diocese were falling off, and resistance in the Jewish community was stiffening. A minute from the WA report of 1930 reflects the situation pretty clearly. It tells us that the bishop recommended that their committee for work among the Jews, quote, resolve itself into a prayer circle, which was heartily agreed to by all. End of quote. The prayer circle continued to pray for, quote, the salvation of the Jews, unquote, and to collect names of Jews collect names of Jews whom the Reverend W.S. Weary could visit and to whom they could send Christian literature. But poor Weary fell ill and resigned as the last Anglican missionary to the Hebrews in Ottawa and the last regular contact for Anglicans with the Jewish community on any regular basis for 4 decades. Now, I want to cover quickly, if I may, the last phases of this story, as I feel they're instructive and bring us eventually to a more promising present and future. In 1933, the WA Prayer Circle reported the fruit of more than 30 years' work to convert Ottawa's Jews to Christianity. In her report, the convener says, "There are 2 Christian Jews whom we know of here in Ottawa, as well as a whole family who attend one of our Anglican churches. There are many others who are Christians secretly, but cannot at present declare themselves openly," and probably haven't done so since. Then in 1935, the convener's report makes mention of a report from a missionary in Germany where, quote, 70 Jews had been baptized in spite of the severe persecution inflicted upon them. I suspect it was because of the persecution. 1 year later, the Prayer Circle's report to the MSCC the Prayer Circle's report to MSCC contains these words, which I think speak volumes about Christian attitudes to persecution of the Jews in those years. Remember, those are the years that I was referring to growing up in Toronto, the years that Brian Doyle remembers here in Ottawa. Here's the quote. "The anti-Semitic propaganda carried on in Germany today and in many parts of Europe has stirred the Jews to more thought and consideration for this subject," that subject being the conversion to Christianity, "than at any other time. Will you pray that more laborers will be sent to gather his harvest?" That's the end of the quote. The final words of this chapter of attempting to convert Ottawa's Jews comes in a minute from the Diocesan WA Executive of March the 4th, 1941. This is about four decades after they started. "Whereas interest in the Jewish Prayer Circle has so diminished that a very small number of representatives attend, and not all branches can find representation, be it resolved that this Jewish Community Prayer Circle be disbanded." An entirely new chapter in Jewish-Christian relations opened in Toronto in 1959, where the Anglican bishop, the Right Reverend F.H. Wilkinson, who was himself a Hebrew Bible scholar, had become very uneasy about continuing attempts by Anglicans to convert Jews in his diocese. He commissioned a study which culminated in the appointment in 1962 of the Reverend Roland de Cornay to explore the possibilities of Jewish-Christian dialogue. And when he did that, Roland de Cornay found that there was a great interest. In fact, there's some doubt in my mind as to who made the first overture in this, but they came together and found that they wanted to have a closer understanding of one another in 1962, and that continued, and I think in some forms probably does still, though I'm not as familiar with that diocese. And in the Worldwide Anglican Congress of 1963, which was held in Toronto, Canon Max Warren, who was General Secretary of the Church Missionary Society in England, one of the biggest of the missionary societies, spelled the end of the conversion mentality among Anglicans and the need for dialogue and understanding with these words: "We have marched around alien Jerichos the requisite number of times. We have sounded the trumpets, and the walls have not collapsed." In 1982, Canon Bill Gilbert, the Ottawa Diocesan Director of Program at the time, was preparing a course on the concept of the Messiah in Jewish tradition. He contacted Rabbi Arnold Fine of this synagogue, and that's the reason I'm so pleased, one of the reasons I'm so pleased to be here tonight in this synagogue. The two men met to discuss the subject, and out of that meeting grew a Jewish-Christian dialogue in Ottawa. Rabbi Fine had had experience with Jewish-Christian dialogue in Boston and brought his expertise and knowledge to that and his understanding. And that dialogue group today includes Orthodox, Conservative, and Reformed Jewish communities, and 5 Christian denominations. And as a member of that dialogue, I'm happy to report that in 16 years, no one has tried to convert anyone, and we're all much stronger in our own faith as a result of our monthly luncheon discussions and conversations. And on that promising note, may I thank you again for the great privilege of being here to speak with you tonight. Thank you.
We'll be taking questions from the floor. However, I've got one, and maybe the story was, you told me, Reverend, that the role of the Freemans counteracting requests made. Remember the story that you told me? Well, the story that you told Elliot Gluck and myself one day when you're in the office, that every time that a request was made to the let's say the diocese for something for the Jewish people, some way or other, the Freeman family learned about it. Yeah. Do you want to tell the story?
Well, I mentioned, I did allude to the fact that the sewing classes were set up. The mission, the Hebrew mission, had sewing classes, but as you can tell from the report, that Mrs. Freeman had 30 sewing machines in her own home, so she could upstage almost anything that the Anglicans tried to do. And in fact, that happened a great deal, I guess, during the history of the whole thing. In fact, as far as I can make out, the Jewish community was extremely tolerant of all that was going on. And they quietly went about creating their own examples of classes that were held in English, classes that were held in sewing, classes that were held in English, of course, partly, I guess, to, as they usually were in missionary times, to help people to read the Bible. But they were always present as well in all of those organizations that existed in the Jewish community. And I'm not quite sure how much the Anglican Hebrew mission did contribute in addition to all those organizations that were already there. I did say, and I think it probably is true, they didn't do much harm. They did help a few people, I guess, with coal and wood for fire and that sort of thing. And they didn't convert many people in 30 or 40 years, so they didn't do any damage that way. And but I don't think it's a happy chapter in the history of the Diocese of Ottawa, the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa. I hope I can only say that I hope we learned a great deal from it.
There's a question down here.
It's delightful for me to see that our records are so beautifully kept. As a member of the Anglican WA, not quite that far back, I think the intention was good. And it's really lovely to think that, like the Aboriginal people, there's no evidence that practical help is needed in Ottawa. Apparently, it's still needed in certain countries like Germany, etc. But could I ask, when you were invited here, did you know or were you told, is this one of the congregations that believe that women are persons?
I assume that.
Jewish women and the Women's Interest Group used to meet in the fire hall on Sunnyside Avenue.
No?
So that so many, maybe mostly in the States, who belonged to one of the branches of Judaism were treated as inferiors. The men didn't consider women were persons. And the rabbis in that particular sect of Jews had to pray every day that they were thankful they were not born a woman. So I'm just wondering about the present status of Jewish people in Ottawa, which I used to know better when I was younger. And of course, my numbers have increased at the same time as the numbers of people in the city.
I don't think I'm qualified to speak on that subject as far as the Jewish community is concerned, but perhaps you could answer that.
Yeah,
Would you like to come up to the microphone?
You want to come up to the microphone? Yes? You want to answer?
Maybe we should repeat the question.
I think what you're referring to is Orthodox Judaism, which is the most religious branch of Judaism. And the women, they have their own role, which they don't look at it as being subservient, and they enjoy their role. They enjoy living as they are. And then there's the other branch, which is conservative, which is the synagogue you're in. And then there's Reform Jews, who are different yet. And I'm not really an authority to say anything else, but that's the branch of Judaism that you're referring to. And we still have many Orthodox Jews in the city.
Thank you very much. If you had the time, maybe tell me a little more afterwards.
Is the microphone?
You speak.
Okay. Your question is extremely interesting, and I'm specifically aware of the prayer that you mentioned. You said that in Jewish synagogues, I think in this one too, there's a prayer where men are thanking God that they have not been made women. Now that is not a discriminatory statement. It only means that usually, traditionally, men are obligated to go to synagogue and pray. Women are not. So they, as men, are simply praying that they are thanking God for what they are. You see, so it is not a discriminatory statement.
I hear some of what you're saying. Thank you very much.
Okay, and also, let me say that indeed, women have always been persons in Judaism. There were some wonderful women throughout the Bible, women who serve to this day as examples of heroism, wisdom, and courage. In Judaism, women are very much respected.
Thank you. Elliot?
I'd just like to make the comment that while the Jews may have looked down upon women, so did Canada. We didn't consider women persons in the Canadian federal system until well into the 20s. So why are we complaining about Jews having done this for years? And we didn't, because women were given a great deal of responsibility that wasn't tied to time. And women were never, in most Jewish homes that I'm aware of, ever considered to be inferior. In fact, most Jewish homes were run by the mother and by the daughters.
Are there any questions directly to Reverend Meggs? Yes, Rhoda?
I'm a descendant of the Slonemsky family, and I'm very emotional right now. 5 generations of my family have lived here. I grew up in the 1930s and 40s. I have no fear who's going to light my Hanukkah candles. I know my grandchildren look at my Hanukkah with delight, and they will remain Jews. I'm well aware of Brian Doyle's Angel Square, Anglican Square, the terrors of the Jewish children before Easter. My hero, Laurie Greenberg, who I tease to this day, killer, personally took it as his responsibility to chase these boys who threw stones at us. And they were afraid of him.
I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you said that, because when I was talking to Brian Doyle, he mentioned, was it Killer?
Killer, absolutely.
Yeah.
My hero.
Killer Greenberg, yes. And he, it must have been quite a scene in Lowertown at that time. I'm grateful for what you said, and I'm pleased to...
The name is Slonemsky.
Slonemsky.
Yes.
Did I mispronounce? I'm sorry.
Yes.
S-L-O-N-E-M.
Yeah. Yes?
Please excuse my poor English. I like to ask, how many people of here have read the New Testament? You read? There are so many contradictions in the New Testament about Jesus' teaching, about Jesus' life. How can some came to a Jew and to say not to consider the Fifth Amendment in the Kabet et Avicha et Imecha? And Jesus was against this. And other thing, we could stay here a whole week to discuss. How can a priest who had read the New Testament correctly came to convert a Jew who has his Torah? I don't say about the king, the prophet, and other things, but this is the basis of our believing. If in the Fifth Amendment, Jesus was against it. You read it. It is in Matthew 10, 34, 35, 39.
Can I just...
But there are only many things again. The exaggeration.
Okay, let Mr. Reverend Meggs answer the question, please.
What?
Let Reverend Meggs answer the question.
Well, I just want to underscore what you're saying. There was monumental arrogance on the part of Anglicans to try to convert Jews. I think we all agree with that now. What I was trying to say, and it's to explain, not to excuse, that it came out of that zealous period where people, particularly in the British Empire, were trying to spread Christianity all over the world. And I read that verse from the hymn. So from the remotest nation, they must know Messiah's name. And Messiah's name to all Christians was Jesus, you see. So to me, it is a story of arrogance. But I can only explain it coming out of that kind of history. I would add this, that theologians, a lot of theologians nowadays, Christian theologians, are writing books about the anti-Semitism of the New Testament. And it is time for Christians to read that and to understand that a lot of the early church, when it was becoming established, not revised, but wrote you must remember that the Gospels were written in the latter part of the first century. And they were trying at that time to justify their own position. And they were also trying to convert Jews back then. But they were spreading out into a Gentile world, leaving the Jewish world behind, and trying to describe in many parts of the New Testament the fact that the Jews were responsible for the crucifixion, which they couldn't have been. They may have assisted, but that was the community that Jesus was in. Jesus was a Jew. Another fact that a lot of non-Jewish people don't seem to understand, that Jesus wasn't the first Christian, he was a Jew. And I think that the fact that so many books are being written now about those early days in the church, and the admission is coming from scholars like Krister Stendahl and so on down at Harvard, that this document has got to be looked at again by Christians, and its anti-Semitism, and it is that, has to be expunged from the New Testament. Now it's a long haul, but it's got to be done. Yes.
I did not live in Ottawa during the 20s and the 30s. I had the privilege of being up in copper mine in the 1970s, okay, for a period of time. A community of about 300 people, 8 missionary churches at that particular time. And women's auxiliary reports would be mirrored in 1970, just as they would have been in 1920. Speaking to a Jesuit priest from France who was up there, he understood the Eskimos and he understood the Cree that were living in that area, the natives, and he explained to me the futility of that particular mission. explain the futility of it. Before coming to tonight's most interesting, for me, lecture, I read in the Canadian Encyclopedia the history of the Anglican Church in Canada. And the mission, the way I heard you talk about it, was really part of the fundamental responsibility of the church in the circa of the period of which they were talking. If I read correctly, sir, it was the Society of the Propagation of the Faith, which originally started in 1698, the Church Missionary Society in 1799, the Colonial CCCS, if you will, in 1838, and what you mentioned, the Missionary Society of the Church of Canada in 1905, 1908. The CCCS had as its objective the concentration of missionary work to settlers in the British Empire. Okay? And this fits in chapter and verse, if you will, with the thesis and theme of that period of time and the responsibility as the church understood its mission at that period of time. And it was most, for me, exciting to hear.
Thank you. And yes.
I just want to know who would have done the translations into Yiddish and Hebrew of the gospel into
You've done it quite 400 years in full.
Yeah, they would have been done in England, I should have thought. I don't think anybody...
They were originally translated almost in Poland, originally.
Oh, were they?
Into Jewish, into Yiddish. They were translated originally into Poland, in Poland, and in certain parts of Russia, and then in England, because remember, Jews came into England much later in the picture in larger numbers, okay, of that period of time. The original, I think, they come in a circle, if you will. Okay, originally, some of the original translations that I have heard about, read about, were done in Poland, Russian, and
Yes, you wanted to speak.
Yes.
Next, do you think that part of the lack of understanding on this matter of relationships between men and women is because Canada is very much aloof from Britain, cut off until memorable years by some of the elders here from any communication except by going back and forth by ship. And so the old British laws that came down through the centuries were not necessarily known over here by the ordinary people. Most of the people that settled in Canada came for something better than they left behind in Europe. So most of the women in Canada were treated relatively well, and they certainly, I have never heard of a Canadian woman that she knows she's the person. I used to have to tell her on the phone and said, so do you think that this gentleman who knows the law so well doesn't realize that Canadian society functioned for generations without any reference to the law?
I don't quite understand.
Yes.
Movie to find out a little differently about that.
Slade?
I'm wondering if there's any record of sermons from that period of time during the Inquisition. Was there work being done to have an impact on the Christian community?
You mean in relation?
Stir up anti-Semitism?
Well, that I would have to defer to our Archivist Emeritus, Jack Francis, who's shaking his head, and I thought he would, because I don't think you'd find anything of that sort. You'd have to go through an awful lot of sermons, and I don't know where you'd look.
Or any other kind of tracts? I realized you were producing materials that come out from the Jewish community. Was there anything going on in the Christian community, in the Anglican community itself?
Outside the Anglican community?
So in the Anglican community?
No, I don't think so. I think this mission was an activity. If you read the WA reports, you find that this is a very minor part of their reports. The work is going on, and these people are distributing literature and visiting homes and so on. But there's nothing, I was going to say, I don't know the situation that you face today, which is called the Messiah Fellowship, and I don't know anything about their activities necessarily. But I would have thought that the Hebrew mission among Anglicans was a minor activity, and I don't think you'd find much more than I've spoken about tonight. It's very interesting, I think. It has been to me anyway, and it's been interesting to me because I look around me tonight and I see friends from way back in the Hart Institute and so on, and it's always interesting to me, and I love the story of Lowertown as well. But I don't think it was, I think it was a sort of fringe activity, as so many of these missionary activities are. You get a zealous group of people within another group, but you don't, it doesn't seem to go right through. Although, I have to say, as I said about my own personal odyssey, the feeling was there. You know, the feeling was there about Jews in the 30s among non-Jews. It was revealed in the attitudes of children that must have had it passed down from their parents when they chased the what we used to call the Sheeny man and held up 3 fingers and called out, "You killed Christ." So the feeling was there. But I don't think that was particularly an Anglican feeling. I don't think the Anglicans had any monopoly on it. That's what I'm saying.
All right, I'll call upon Elliot Gluck to thank the speaker.
My wife has asked me to keep this to 25 words or less. When I first heard about your talk, Reverend Meggs, it occurred to me that as a new 80-year-old in Ottawa, I lived through the period you were talking about and never had any concept of the fact that such a thing was taking place in Ottawa. In fact, I've inquired from a number of my friends about the same age, and only one has even indicated that he was aware of the fact that such a mission was going on.
That's the best news I've heard.
It strikes me that this is an aspect of the relationship between the Jewish community of Ottawa and the general community of Ottawa that needed to be explored. I think the work you did in your book was outstanding. The thing that I'm sorry to say is that I don't think any of the records in the Jewish organizations go back far enough to indicate any reaction on the part of the organizations, such as the synagogues, to this kind of thing. And it's unfortunate that the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society didn't get started much sooner so that we could have had those records today. On behalf of the Society, I'd like to present this to you.
Thank you.
Enjoy it.
There is a book published by Reverend May
by the diocese.
And Peter will tell you how to get a hold of it if you want to after. Thank you.
It's Anglicanism in the Ottawa Valley. It's available through. There's only one chapter in it, of course, on the Hebrew mission, but it's available through Canterbury House, and I think it's available through the archives. Is it not, Jack?
Yeah, there's a copy in the archives. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Elliot. Do you want to say something? No. All right. Elaine Brodsky and Shirley have refreshments for you at the end of the meeting. There's no further agenda. The meeting's adjourned. I cannot tell you the score of the hockey game. I can only tell you one thing. It started with 0-0. Thank you and have a good evening.